Canadian might be the most confusing player to judge in Rainbow Six Siege history. If you look at their stats, you see someone who needs to be dropped from their org ASAP. But if you look at the trophies, you're talking about someone who's in the GOAT debate. Before talking about leadership trophies or anything else, we have to address the biggest criticism. Canadians' stats are bad, like genuinely terrible. And this is not something that started recently. Except for the first 2 years of his pro league journey, he's been dropping stats every year. From 2016 to about 2019, he was a great player. He was actually one of the best players at the time. He wasn't some support player hiding behind his teammates. He was actually winning gunfights. But after that, things started changing. 2019, negative 44 on KD. 2020, negative 47 on KD. Almost at the bottom of the table in ratings. And remember, this was the year that Canadian won the 6 Invitational with SSG. We're gonna get deeper into those in a bit. 2021, negative 19. A little improvement, but the stats are terrible in literally everything. In 2022, negative 40. And buckle up, shit's about to get crazy. In 2023, he is minus 121 on KD. The worst KD of the year. And just when you think it's not going to get any worse, in 2024, he's minus 143 on KD. The worst KD. I'm sorry, I don't mean to, I can't help it. The worst KD of the year again in 2025, minus 195 on KD. And again, the worst KD of competitive Siege in 2025. And 8 months into 2026, he's already negative 179 on KD and counting. And again, the worst KD of the year by far. For multiple years in a row, Canadian literally had the worst KD in competitive Siege. I tried comparing Canadians to some other big names to make Canadian look bad, so in this part I genuinely tried. Fabian might be the closest comparison to Canadian, one of the greatest IGL Siege has ever seen. He was dropping great numbers during the G2/Penta Dynasty era, but back then, so was Canadian. All of Canadian's success as a player came with one roster, like almost one roster. As soon as the Prime G2 roster started to collapse, Fabian disappeared. And even after leaving G2 Esports, he tried so hard to rebuild his empire, but he failed. So I guess Canadian really wins this argument. Pengu could be another close comparison. One of the greatest players in Siege history, one of the GOATs of the game. But again, just like Fabian, most of his success came with the Prime G2 roster. And just like Fabian again, as soon as the roster started to collapse, Pengu wasn't the person he was before. Pengu's stats during the Prime, Penta, and G2 roster were crazy. But again, he was dropping insane stats in an era where Canadian was dropping good stats as well. And something else about Fabian and Pengu. They both retired as a player so early. We will never know how great of a player they would be if they were still playing the game in this era, in this age, in this year. Canadian got the longevity nobody else had. And the third player I chose for this comparison is Shepard. Okay, he is like kind of closer actually. Longer career, support role IGL trophies, has been elite for years, but Canadian runs over Shepard in terms of trophies. Canadian has won 2 SIs in his career, enough to put him above Shepard. Okay, the weird thing about Canadian is there isn't really another player like Canadian. They either lack the longevity, lack the consistency, or lack the trophies. Now let's get into the biggest argument in favor of Canadian. Canadian has reached the biggest stages with Continuum, Evil Geniuses, SSG, Dark Zero, maybe Sonics, and Shopify Rebellion. Different organizations, different playstyles, different teammates, and completely different eras. Did Canadian just simply join a team that was already winning, or did he build his own empire? Okay, honestly, going through Continuum and Evil Geniuses history before Canadian is kind of pointless because that does not exist. Those were literally the first few days of competitive Rainbow Six Siege, so the history before that just simply doesn't exist. Canadian was the SI 2017 champion with Continuum, but with EG he didn't win anything, just because unfortunately they existed in the same era as Penta and G2 Esports. So long story short, Canadian made back-to-back grand finals with EG and lost all of them. Now, Space Station Gaming. Okay, before Canadian joined SSG was already a strong team. In the SI 2019, SSG was the only team that took a map off G2. G2 had a complete undefeated run throughout the entire 6 Invitational from the very first day all the way to the end of the grand final, and the only time that they lost the map was against SSG in the playoffs. But despite being one of the strongest teams in North America, they could not win the biggest trophy. Before they had Canadian, not a single player on that roster had made a single grand final appearance before. Okay, except for Bosco, who was the 6 Invitational 2017 Xbox champion. Okay, Siege in console and Siege in PC are completely two different things, especially back in 2017. Then Canadian and False joined. A few months later, 6 Invitational 2020 champions. Dark Zero might be the most interesting one. Before Canadian joined DZ, they had okay regional performance, no deep runs in any tournament, and obviously obviously no international trophies. Then Canadian joined. A few months later, Charlotte Major champions. And the lack of high-tier experience wasn't only limited to the org. Tamazu was basically a new player. He was a YouTuber who transitioned into a professional Siege player. He had very little tier 1 exposure. NJR was a talented player, but before Canadian, no S-tier Grand Finals. Eclipse's story is a little different. He was already an elite player. He reached the 6th Invitational 2017 Grand Final and ironically lost it to Canadian and Continuum. But he had not won a major until that point. Hyper, just like Eclipse, had experienced a Grand Final match before, and again, just like Eclipse, he had lost that too. Dark Zero is probably one of the strongest arguments for Canadian because it was not a roster full of proven champions, it was a talented team that needed something, and somehow Canadian was the solution. Sonics is usually the chapter that everybody kind of neglects and forget about it, and I kind of understand why. Sonic's project just simply did not have enough time. Shortly after Canadian joined, the organization left Rainbow Six Siege, but before that happened, they did have success. They won an NAL stage. Oh, you might say, oh, okay, it's just an NAL stage, bro, chill. That is important because Sonics has only won 2 NAL stages in their entire history, and one of those happened with Canadian. And this brings us to Shopify Rebellion. Young talent, experienced players, and a proven superstar. This roster is basically the team straight from Sonics plus Spoit. Obviously, Shopify Rebellion had never won anything before Canadian because the org just wasn't a part of Siege before. But the players. Ambi is a weird one. Shortly after he started his professional career on Sonics, Canadian joined the org. So it's kind of fair to say that before Canadian, he wasn't even a pro player. Rexon and Surf didn't have tier 1 Grand Final experiences before Canadian, and all of these players who had never played a Grand Final match ever before in their career made it to the Salt Lake City Major Grand Final. But Spoit is a different one, because unlike other players, Spoit was a major champion. He won the Berlin Major in 2022 with Rogue, and he reached the Gamers' 8 Grand Finals in 2023 with M80, but they lost that one to BDS. So it's fair to say Canadian didn't create him, but he revived him. And there's the thing I discovered about Canadian, and I want to call it the Canadian cycle. It almost always goes like this. At stage 1, Canadian joins the team. The results are mid at best. At stage 2, just out of nowhere, they either win a trophy or make Grand Finals. And in stage 3, they go back to being average as fuck. And this could be a big argument against Canadian. Almost like everything after EG and Continuum, he keeps making one Grand Final in every organization that he plays for. You know, there's a difference between creating a championship moment and creating a championship era. SSG never became the next G2, DZ never dominated the scene after the Charlotte Major, and Shopify Rebellion had not become an unstoppable team. Canadian haters, watch this part, this is your favorite, let's go. Was Canadian actually getting carried? At the SI 2020, Rampion faults were incredible. Canadian was one of the weaker players statistically and worst on the team. At the Charlotte Major, Pambazu and NGR were among the best performers. Canadian was not the star, the worst player on his team again. At the Salt Lake City Major, every player was putting an insane amount of effort, especially Ambi, who was dropping 20 bombs after 20 bombs, and Canadian was the worst player on the roster by far. And even during his last tournaments with EG, he was clearly getting carried too, like the Pro League Season 9 where they made Grand Finals versus Empire and lost. Geo was statistically great, and Canadian was asleep. If he's not winning because of individual performance, why does it keep happening? Why do different teams improve after he joined? Why do young players around him explode? The problem with judging Canadian is that Siege stats never really show the entire thing. They show kills, deaths, plants, KD, and similar things. They do not show preparation, leadership, team structure, communication, helping teammates improve, understanding how players fit together, and etc. And based on his career, something is clearly happening, because making one Grand Final with bad stats could be luck. Maybe even 2, but doing it across different organizations, maybe that's not just all luck. So we can all agree on one thing. If there's one thing Canadian is good at, is that he's got one of the biggest brains in Siege. And what do the people with the biggest brains do? They coach. And something I'd love to see Canadian do is to just stand behind the players, let somebody else take your role in the roster, and just lead this team into winning something. Your time as a player might be over, but I believe that you can be one of the greatest coaches in Siege history. But something Canadian is afraid to do is that if coaching turns out to not be his thing, he may never be able to transition back to a player. And I believe that's why he's not considering becoming a coach. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below.